Hi again, this is part 2. You can find part 1 in the description. Let's start. How did you get here? When I look back at my life and the things I did before I made a positive change, I realize how much of my own pain, anxiety, and problems came from 2 main sources. First, there was my environment. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee is the most segregated city in the United States. It has the highest rate of teen pregnancy in the country and one of the highest high school dropout rates, a statistic I almost contributed to. Although I had great guidance from my parents, I fell into the wrong crowd. Most of the people I knew from back then are still there, and they're still doing the same things, getting high, having too many kids, and getting in trouble. I left Milwaukee to go to a small school in Minnesota. The environment was different, but I was still the same kid who was up to no good. I was a product of my environment, and the environment made an impression on me at an impressionable age. Long story short, I got in a lot of trouble. I almost got kicked out of college for academic probation multiple times. There were some legal troubles, and at one point I almost packed everything up and went back home. In a way, the situations I put myself in were my fault, but then again, they weren't. That's the thing about the past and the decisions you made in it. They're your fault, but they're also not your fault. We talked about the quilt of your personality earlier. In a way, many of the things you're prone to do come from influences around you. You can't use that as an excuse for the mistakes you have made, but understanding those influences can at least help you understand why you did those things. I could easily cast off my past as saying I was a dumbass. That answer would suffice. I was a dumbass. But that explanation wouldn't do the past justice, and it doesn't involve a high enough level of self-awareness to avoid repeating those mistakes. If I hadn't first identified the influences around me that helped me act that way, bad friends, negative culture, proximity to harmful substances, etc., I wouldn't have known what to avoid. And sure, my situation may have been a bit cut and dried, stop hanging out with losers. But what about you? What if you did everything right and still got the short end of the stick? What if you followed the rules and now feel unfulfilled and unhappy? Regardless of your circumstances or the way you feel, one word points to the reasons for both. The word that decides your fate, one word determines your future. It determined where you are right now. It's not motivation, productivity, or mindset, although these 3 do play a role. The word that makes a world of difference in your life, for better or worse, is decision. I remember when I was sitting on the front steps of the dormitory I lived in at age 24. My eye was swollen shut from the fight the night before. I had a painful mixture of a headache and a concussion. I sat there, smoking my cigarette. My body was being punished in several ways at once. Having such a horrible night made me reflect on what happened in my life up until that point. How does a kid with all the potential in the world end up broke, basically homeless, and drowning in drugs and alcohol? Decisions. There was the decision to take my first hit of weed, the decision to skip classes and go out to the bar on school nights, the decision to live off my student loan money instead of holding a job throughout college. At the time, I probably didn't look back at my life and realize it was my decisions that led to this outcome. I did what most of us do, blame the world or other people for my lot in life. Earlier I talked about how our negative choices aren't necessarily our fault because of the circumstances and the environment we were brought up in, but at the same time, it's important to realize you're the common denominator in all your problems. Regardless of what helped you get here, the responsibility lies with you now. It's simultaneously depressing and liberating to know you're responsible for the type of life you want to live. This isn't me telling you to pull yourself up by the bootstraps and succeed no matter what. I'm aware that there may be things outside of your control that are real obstacles to the life you want to have. You can't up and quit your job if you have a family to support. You can't drop 50 pounds overnight. You've spent years living, behaving, and believing a certain way, and that's not going to change in an instant. You can do what I did. I started small and continued to build. But it started with a deep feeling of desperation, a point where staying the same hurt worse than changing. True change doesn't happen until you decide to change. You won't decide to change unless not changing is worse. How to learn from your mistakes further. My characterization of a loser is someone who, after making a mistake, doesn't introspect, doesn't exploit it, feels embarrassed and defensive rather than enriched with a new piece of information, and tries to explain why he made the mistake rather than moving on. 1. Nassim Taleb. Life is like a maze with thousands of tiny little forks in the road. Circumstances influence your life, of course, but decision-making makes up a good portion of what happens to you. Like I said before, these decisions aren't your entire fault, per se, in the way that you can't blame Pavlov's dog for salivating. If you've been told thousands of times a certain way of living works and you make decisions based on what you're told and believe, the blame can be spread around a little bit, but now it's time to own up to what's happened so you can start over. There's the decision you may have made about your career that wasn't based on what the true you wanted, but by the influence of society, your parents, and your peers. There's the decision to take the route of certainty because you've been led to believe the world is a scary place and that security of any form exists. It doesn't. The financial collapse of 2008 proved that. Take the same you and put yourself in several different scenarios where you make different decisions in the same situations, and you have completely different lives. The point in saying this is that although you can't take your regretful decisions back, you can learn from them. Let's look at your decisions objectively and be honest about their role in your current life. Once you've faced them head-on, you can move out of the repetitive cycle of blame, rationalization, and avoidance. Let's avoid the typical vanilla answers too, the ones you'd give in an end-of-chapter exercise of a book called Unleash Your Bliss. Seriously, stare your fuck-ups directly in the face for once. It's hard. It's painful. You'll feel guilty for wasting so much time and wish you could change the past. Ruminating over the past is useless, but examining it in naked truth and moving on has value. I'll go first. I burned $70,000 on a college education that I didn't even complete. Lessons learned: be wary of loans, examine the true value of what you're buying, and remember the cost of falling short of the finish line. I almost ruined my life over drugs. Lessons learned: the people you associate yourself with are extremely important. Drugs don't replace the whole inside of you. And value your time because years of it can go up in smoke, literally up in smoke. I could go on forever. I've since let go of these mistakes, which we'll talk about next, but I've had enough uncomfortable dialogues with myself to the point where I feel very confident in avoiding repeating those dangerous mistakes in the future. What are your lessons learned, the real ones? Did you waste a decade of your life working behind a desk pushing papers? Admit it. Now you won't waste another decade. Do you barely recognize the person you are today because you continually said no to new but scary opportunities? Admit it. Now you can start saying yes. The mask of rationalizing blinds you from a better future. Every time you say something like, "I'm doing it for the kids," "I can't afford to take risks," or "I don't have enough time," you're putting a nail in your own coffin. I'm not saying that because I want something different for you. I'm saying that because you do, and you're not doing anything about it. After you've taken the time to examine your life, own up to your mistakes, and face the truth, you can truly start over. If you don't, you'll continue to spin your wheels and live like a record on repeat. Key takeaways and exercises: until you own up to the mistakes you've made in the past, you'll never be able to move forward as a new person. Circumstances dictate your life to a certain degree, but at some point, it's important to take responsibility for your role in them. Mistakes are only costly if you decide to never learn from them. In your downloadable end-of-chapter worksheet, or on pen and paper, answer the following questions. What are some of the key mistakes you made in the past? What can you learn from them moving forward? What are some rationalizations you've made about your life that you need to own up to? Surrender and acceptance, how to let go of your negative past. Think about what happens when you die. Your body just lets go. Your heart stops beating. Your lungs stop taking in air. Even your bowels let loose and you poop on yourself. Fun fact: when you die, you have no problems. You have no anything. You're gone. When I think of the changes I made in my life, they feel more like deaths of former versions of myself than changes to the same person. One has to kill a few of one's natural selves to let the rest grow, a very painful slaughter of innocence. Henry Sidgwick. It's in your nature as a human being to push, strive, and fix. You think to yourself, if only I work harder, if only I patched up the holes in the ship, if only I try, then my situation will get better. Sometimes, it's better to scrap everything altogether and start over. Let's start with your identity. Maybe you went to school for business. You graduated and worked in corporate America for 10 years. You earned a nice salary, but you now feel like something's missing. You want to write a book, start a non-profit organization, or just travel around the world, but you can't, because you can't let go of who you think you are. You spent $100,000 on your degree and have just finished paying off those student loans. You spent 10 years climbing the ladder, gaining respect and admiration from your colleagues. Do you really want to throw it all away? You're not happy, but you also don't want to lose what you already have. You try to please yourself with promotions, toys, and whatever else, but the feeling still returns. Most people aren't willing to throw away an identity they've spent a long time creating, but killing your identity gives you room to grow a new one. Your situation could be the opposite end of the spectrum. You've been working at the factory or the fast food joint for the past 10 years. You've wrapped your identity around the idea that you're only suited to do this type of work, and you don't have what it takes to do anything else. There are haves and the have-nots. You've come to grips with the idea of being a have-not for the rest of your life. This seems like an identity you'd want to get rid of, right? Even if the situation is far from ideal, it's easier to cope with. If you believe you have no potential, then you're off the hook. You weren't smart enough or talented enough in the first place, so the results you've gotten are to be expected. The thought that you, in fact, do have the potential to succeed, but have simply wasted it, can be too much to bear. Practicing what I preach is no easy task, but if the identity you've created for yourself hasn't led to the type of life you want to live, perhaps you should kill it. What if, for a little while, you let go of who you thought you were and who you're supposed to be? Give yourself a chance to live, experiment, and see what happens without judgment. When you're concerned about appearances, stuck in your head, and fretting over outcomes, it's hard to be creative. Instead of saying, I need to do X to feel Y, like you've done your entire life, we're going to start focusing on doing simply for the sake of doing. We grip the steering wheel of life and do our best to stay on course, but during a storm, a tight grip and a hard shift of the wheel can actually lead to a crash. Sometimes you need to drift until you come to a complete stop so you can gather yourself. We're going to drift, and then we're going to stop. The power of surrender. I do yoga as part of my exercise routine. In yoga, the goal is to surrender to the postures. See, yoga can be anything but relaxing while you're doing it. You must stretch your body in ways it's unaccustomed to. The positions will make your muscles hurt, and you may even feel like you're going to run out of breath. During the tough postures and positions, you're supposed to remember to maintain your breathing and extend into the positions. You surrender your body to those moments during stress, for your body to feel good under normal conditions. Yoga reminds me of life. Sometimes, your life is going to be chaotic. You have your jobs, and your kids, and your spouse, and your bills, and your errands, and your issues, and your baggage, and your bullshit. You're wound up tight like a rubber band stretched to the point it's going to snap. You're wound up because you're fighting against the way of the world. You want your circumstances to be different, and you can't fully accept them as they are right now. We're often told that doing more will cure our anxieties, but when you're doing in a frustrated and fixated state, you'll never enjoy the process and you'll make it harder than it should be. Think about negative emotions and how easily they come. It takes no effort for us to create an insanely inaccurate negative story about ourselves. When you're worried about something or stuck in your head, your inner dialogue is very convincing, even though it isn't true. If it's easy to conjure up negative feelings and stories about ourselves, why should it be harder to come up with positive ones? They come from the same mind. They're both a product of imagination. We can cultivate the power to move forward in our lives in a relaxed state, but like yoga, it's difficult to lean in to chaos to find that ultimate relaxation. What you're going to attempt to do is reinvent your life, without constantly beating yourself up throughout the process and gripping the steering wheel of life too hard. I struggle when I grip too hard, when I consider the mistakes I made the week before, when I wish the climb was easier, and when I obsess over a future that may or may not come. When I can let go, even for a little while, I can create. I write, and I only seem to do my best work when I'm not caught up in the storm of life. I know it's there, but I find my way to the eye of it and work. What are the storms in your life? What do you wish was easier? Negative circumstances will never vanish from your life completely. One of the main reasons it took me so long to change was the fact that I wanted things to be different. I kept fighting against the fact that they weren't different. I wasn't able to say, this is where I'm at now and I have to move forward. I couldn't surrender. It's hard to surrender. It's hard to surrender because we build prisons of circumstance with our past. When you tear the walls down brick by brick, you can begin your escape and will eventually live a new life. The power of acceptance. On one fateful night, I found myself in a jail cell. Long story short, I was in possession of plants that didn't belong in your typical garden. I didn't spend much time in there, 3 days, but the experience made me really think about the decisions I made that led up to that point. When you're in jail, you have nothing but time to think. I sat on my bunk for hours replaying everything. I played the movie in my head where I made the right moves, didn't get caught up with a bad crowd, and walked the straight and narrow. It was too late for all of that. No matter how desperate I was to change the past and live in a better present, it wasn't going to happen right then and there. Now what? I thought. Even after I got out, I wasn't heading out into the best of circumstances. I accepted where I was at the moment, and made the decision to make something of myself, for a little while at least. I fell back into the same patterns as before, because I listened to the stories in my head telling me I couldn't be anything more than a pot-smoking punk. Eventually, my life got much better, but it happened through several starts and stops, ups and downs, and periods of cleanliness and relapses. When it comes to failures and setbacks, I've learned to accept all of them. It doesn't always feel good, but acceptance is all you have when you haven't been living right. You could beat yourself up, rack your brain trying to rewrite a story written in stone, and get nowhere. Or, you can admit you messed up, accept that you've done some things that are irreversible, and move on. I'd like to say I've done that. I'm not immune to setbacks, but I'm no longer in that truly dark place I used to be in. Had I fought against my darkness, instead of accepting its existence during that time, I'd probably still be there. Forgive yourself. Accept what you've done and what has happened to you. I know these are just words, but they are words to follow. Books can only point to a sign that says do this. I've followed the same process over and over and over. Now, I look back at the older versions of me and they look alien to who I am now. I've become obsolete and updated myself more often than Windows software. The point I'm trying to make is that change is hard when you think of yourself as a fixed entity with characteristics so hardwired they're inescapable. When you think of yourself as the phoenix rising from the ashes, the snake shedding its skin, or the demolished building that gets reconstructed, you can climb up the mountain of success without the 50-pound bag of baggage strapped to your back. The forgiveness and acceptance process will happen again and again. This is your game, and you get to play the levels over and over until you win. I wish I could wave a wand and change your situation this instant, but I can't. This is where you are now. You have what you have, and you can only do what you can with what you have. Time to die. I've been traveling on this road too long, just trying to find my way back home. The old me is dead and gone, dead and gone. Justin Timberlake, I've told you much of my story. I reached the point of true acceptance, the point where I realized nothing but moving forward in a positive direction was going to help me change my circumstances. You've learned to start where you are, instead of wishing you had a different starting point. Now we've reached the most important phase. It's time for you to die. The metaphor I'm using might seem trite or insignificant, but there's a large difference between trying to change your situation while remaining the same person and changing who you are. You've spent your life to this point becoming someone, and if that person is incapable of making a change, you can become a new person. The idea of killing the old you is 10 times more powerful than the idea of change or self-improvement. Choke the life out of the person who continues to daydream and do nothing. Put a knife through the heart of the person who believes they aren't talented and have no room to grow. Take the person who believed they were a victim of circumstance and throw them off a bridge. On top of your normal end-of-chapter exercises, I want you to try an additional one. Write down all your insecurities, doubts, false beliefs about the world, mean things people said to you, the pain you've felt, setbacks you've encountered, things you've done to others, circumstances you feel trapped by, all of it. Write all your bullshit down on a piece of paper until your fingers feel like they're going to fall off. Then burn it. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The old you is dead now. Let the reinvention process begin. Key takeaways and exercises. It's easy to fall into the trap of wishing things were different. You can replay your life story with scenes you wish turned out differently. Or you can accept where you are right now until you forgive yourself for what you've done and what has been done to you. You'll stay stuck instead of thinking in terms of change or self-improvement. Think in terms of death to your former self in your downloadable end-of-chapter worksheet. Or on pen and paper, answer the following questions. What parts of your identity are you clinging on to because of time invested, influences around you, or wanting to avoid the truth? What are some circumstances/situations you wish were different but can't change immediately? What actions will you choose to focus on instead? What do you need to forgive yourself for so you can start over? What beliefs, personality traits, and actions are you going to kill so you can be born again? Click here to download the Chapter 4 worksheet, including examples for answers to each of the above questions and exercises. The first day of the rest of your life. We all act out roles in the movie of life. Some of us act like the star, and others like extras. It's just the truth. Every now and then, regular people like you and me decide they want to step out of the shadows. You've seen it countless times in movies. The protagonist is always unassuming at first, Cinderella washing floors, Katniss Everdeen minding her own business in District 12, Hilary Swank as a no-name boxer, and for a while things don't work out their way. The protagonist is down and out. She trudges along, until one day, the light bulb goes off in her head. When all seems lost, she has an idea, a dream, a new mission, and she decides right then and there she's going to pursue it without quitting. When it comes to real life, the story usually doesn't work out that way, but you can reach a similar fed-up moment and seek to change, even though the change isn't as dramatic as it is in a film. See, Movies have one magic moment, but real success stories come through hundreds or even thousands of little magic moments. My life reached a low point before I decided enough was enough. I lived in a dorm room at age 24 because it was all I could afford. I was working 12-hour shifts at an electronics factory. This factory was the place where dreams went to die. All day, I'd sit on an assembly line and put the same piece into the same circuit board. I worked with mostly older people in their late 30s and 40s. They all had the same look in their eyes, defeat. Regardless of what led them here, this is where they were going to be for the foreseeable future. I figured I'd be doing this for a while too, because I fell short of finishing my degree and owed the school so much money I couldn't re-enroll. To cope with it all, I would get as high as I possibly could during the day and drink as much as my stomach could handle at night. One night, I got so drunk I decided to pick a fight with someone I shouldn't have picked a fight with. To this day, I don't even remember what the guy looks like, but I do remember my eye socket being the size of a tennis ball the next day. I tried going back to work, but the fluorescent lighting irritated my eye and gave me severe headaches. I took a few days off to recover. Although I was in physical pain, I felt relieved to not be at the factory. I had no idea what I was going to do next, but I decided I was never going back to that place. Getting beat up was a blessing in disguise, because it led to a series of events that helped change my life forever. I started looking for a new job and found one as the manager of a local video store. Although it doesn't sound like much to you, it was a pivotal moment in my life. Before then, I'd been hired and fired at a string of menial jobs. I'd never been promoted. It's hard to get promoted when you don't make it past 6 months. I applied to be a clerk at the video store, but they asked me to interview to be the store manager. It was the first time anybody trusted me and gave me actual responsibility. I wanted to live up to expectations. I wanted to learn how to become a better leader and person so I could become a better manager. This was one of the first magic little moments. Getting hired as the manager of the store inspired me to learn. I read books on motivation and leadership after work. I watched TED Talks and interviews of successful people. For the first time in my life, I felt energized and hungry. This motivation spilled over into new avenues and led me to walk through the doors of opportunity when I spotted them. At the time, I tended to write small essays as Facebook statuses. It was my mental and creative outlet. I'd post about what I was reading, insights I gained, and encouraging words I thought would help my friends. One of my friends took notice and saw something in me. He was working on a startup, a news website, and he wanted me to write for it. The first time I wrote was like the first time you hit a crack pipe. Finally, someone had given me the permission I was unable to give myself. I took little leaps in the early stages of my writing career, like submitting my work to publications I didn't think my writing was qualified for. I wrote every day. To date, I've written more than 300 blog posts and now 2 books. Each time I sat down and put words on the page was a magic moment. When you find that thing, it's not hard to do. Finding that thing inside you starts with a point of being desperate enough or inspired enough to take at least one step. It might not even be a step that's in the exact direction of your dreams. Becoming a video store manager certainly isn't the first step in the How to Become a Writer handbook, but any step where you decide you no longer want to go backwards is worthwhile. Hundreds of decisions later, I'm here, doing something I always wanted, but never thought I'd be doing. I didn't know what I wanted to begin with. I just knew I was fed up with my situation, and I said yes to anything I felt would move me in a new direction. What's the point of the story? The point is that you are now in the same position as I was. You just want something different. To make the transition, I suggest treating yourself like the hero in your own movie. In the hero's journey, the protagonist accepts the call. It's time for you to accept the call and begin to experience the little magic moments that lead to your total reinvention. Most people never reach the triumphant climax and come home victorious. They just die, and they lived as if the remaining pieces of their life story were ripped out and discarded, never to be seen. Look, I'm practical. I'm not going to pretend like your story will work out. It can, but no book in the world will force you to accept the call. I was just like you at one point. I had to read book after book, blog post after blog post, and watch interview after interview before I truly rose to the occasion. I wrote this book because if even just one of you accepts the call, it means I've used my time on this earth well. See, our stories are intertwined. Helping you helps me. I'm on a mission to open the eyes of as many people as possible. I know it's more than possible to turn your life around and start a rewarding journey. The remainder of this chapter will discuss ideas to move you in the right direction. In the next chapter, we'll discuss the nuts and bolts of what it takes to change. The power of yes. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about how you can begin to think about what the new you wants. Maybe you have a bit of an idea. Maybe you're completely lost. Either way, I want you to consider saying yes to everything you come across for a while. Say yes to buying that new business book. Say yes to going to that conference without knowing anybody there. Say yes to taking those guitar lessons, starting the 30-day yoga program, or taking an introductory class on computer programming. Whatever it is, just say yes. You can attract serendipity by saying yes. When you look at a successful person, you're looking at someone who said yes to certain opportunities. Call it luck, but people who succeed all have one thing in common: they did something. Per Tony Robbins, there are 6 drivers of human behavior. One of them is certainty. As humans, we crave stability and want to feel secure in our decision-making. Uncertainty is also another driver. We like variety in our lives and get bored if things become too stale. That's where you're at right now. Your life went stale. Let your need for uncertainties trump your need for certainty. Remember what I said earlier in the book. I'll never tell you what you must do. I'll only tell you what will or won't happen. If you don't say yes to new people, new opportunities, and new ideas, your life will likely stay the same. If you do say yes, however, something will happen, and oftentimes it's positive. The idea that crosses your mind, the one that makes you think, nah, it couldn't happen, is the one that wants you to say yes to it. It's begging and pleading for you to walk through the door of opportunity. Remember that when you spot it. It's also important to remember that certainty doesn't even exist. I'll explain. The myth of certainty changing yourself is a process that happens from the inside out. The process starts within because the things you value and believe drive your behavior. Remember the examples I mentioned earlier in the book? The stories we tell ourselves? Everything you've done in your life is based on those stories. Those stories create values, and those values determine the quality of your life. The word value itself throws you off a little bit, doesn't it? When you think of something valuable, it's attributed to something rare or luxurious. If you've come to this book seeking change, there are obviously things happening in your life that you don't want to happen. So how can they be equated with the word value? The reason why your values have led you astray is because they're built on a foundation of fear. Change happens only when you redefine your values. You can only redefine your values if you see how they're driven. There are tons of different values we're driven by, but if there's one that stands above all others in terms of keeping people stuck, it's certainty. The future both frightens and excites us. We spend time fantasizing about it often, yet it doesn't usually work out the way we want it to. Why? We're afraid to take risks. I wrote this section specifically to debunk the myth of certainty and adjust your views on risk-taking. Without this foundational value change, valuing freedom and autonomy over certainty, you'll never have the life you want. I can confidently say that regardless of who's reading this, I don't know or particularly care what your dreams are, but I want you to reach them. And to reach any true dream, Valuing your freedom helps you get there. A great step towards realizing certainty is a myth involves taking a hard look at what you already know. The most obvious yet ignored fact of life: my wife has a friend named Stephanie, changed for the book. Stephanie is a bubbly woman who always has a smile on her face. She was my wife's roommate for 2 years in college. She liked to have fun, at times maybe a little too much, at the bar. But she was a normal kid with a bright future. She graduated school and got a job working at the Mayo Clinic, one of the best hospitals on the planet. Everything was going great. She believed in the certainty of getting her degree and finding a great job, and she was rewarded for it. She was at the peak of her life, both professionally and personally. Little did she know, life was about to throw her a curveball. One day, my wife mentioned her name and seemed pretty upset. It turns out after Stephanie went to the doctor for pain in her leg, they ran tests and found cancer in her femur. She's undergoing treatment right now and is set to have surgery to hopefully rid her body of the cancer. She has an extremely high chance of survival, which is great. I'm guessing after her recovery, she'll have a different outlook on her life. I don't know what her experience will do for her, but I can be certain her sense of certainty is gone. You've heard stories like this before. Someone gets sick and recovers, suffers a terrible accident, and in one way or another stares death directly in the face. Afterwards, they act in a polar opposite way of their former selves. They write books, climb mountains, jump out of planes, start businesses and foundations, run for office, and a myriad of bucket list items get crossed off their list. Is this what it takes to snap out of the myth of certainty? The philosopher Seneca said, "You act like mortals in all that you fear, and like immortals in all that you desire." We're stingy with our finances, but generous with our time. Morbid as it sounds, death hangs over our heads every day, but we live as if it doesn't. I'm not here to look down on you for wasting time. I watch my fair share of Netflix, lie around on the couch at times, and have some beers with friends on occasion. All the while, however, I continue to remind myself that nothing is guaranteed. You've driven past horrific accidents on the freeway, failing to realize someone has died on the same road you're driving on and just happened to be the statistic you easily could have been. You read a news story about someone your age and gender that gets sick, but you think it'll ever happen to you. While you're meticulously planning for your future to find certainty by taking a job you don't want to save money you may never use to fund a retirement you might never reach, the universe and our planet is causing mayhem and destruction in thousands of little instances per day in order to push evolution's agenda forward. Some say the universe was born out of uncertainty. If you believe in a creator, he put you here and gave you free will, so the options are still endless. I keep my mortality in mind, not to be morbid, but to be reminded. If the idea of death seems too distant, let's explore some practical reasons why your belief in certainty is nothing more than your favorite flavor of Kool-Aid. The turkey problem: why your goose might be cooked without you knowing it. Consider a turkey that is fed every day. Every single feeding will firm up the bird's belief that it is the general rule of life to be fed every day by friendly members of the human race looking out for its best interests. As a politician would say, on the afternoon of the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, something unexpected will happen to the turkey. It will incur a revision of belief. Nassim Taleb. We all remember the recent financial crisis. The housing market, the world economy, and the people who depend on it all incurred a revision of belief. Save for the few who predicted the collapse, there was certainty that nothing like this could ever happen. Yet it happened. It was something Taleb refers to as a black swan event. A black swan is an event or occurrence that deviates beyond what is normally expected of a situation and is extremely difficult to predict. Although these events are rare, they have a disproportionate impact on people who aren't prepared for them. E.g., People who staked most their money in their homes on faulty mortgages and worked for susceptible companies without saving enough. Would you rather change your belief in certainty before it's too late, or feel the impact of it through something like a black swan? Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Mike Tyson, here's where the problem gets even worse. We've recovered. In fact, the stock market has tripled since the crash. I live in a city called Rochester, Minnesota. It has one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country, and the people living in it are irrationally exuberant about the future. The problem with overconfidence and presumptions about the future is that when things go wrong, they go very wrong. We're lulled into a false sense of security while another crisis is making its way around the corner. What's worse, the people in power don't even account for the possibilities of these extremely rare events. The financial crisis was an unprecedented event. Do you think the powers that be are preparing for an even more unprecedented event in the future? Absolutely not. In fact, the people who were largely responsible for the collapse were put in charge of the recovery. Many of the unsound practices used pre-2008, when the crash happened, are being used again under different labels and monikers. Call it anecdotal, but one way or another, it's coming. Uncertainty is the way of the world. It's how the world grows. The people equipped to handle an uncertain world will be the ones who survive and even thrive. Only when the tide goes out do you discover who's been swimming naked. Warren Buffett, here's one inarguable point. Job security is an oxymoron. Kmart was an industry giant for more than 100 years, and now the company has collapsed. The ecosystem of entrepreneurship is impartial, and as an employee of a company, you're always at risk. What hurts people most, I've noticed, is when they stake too much of their lives, well-beings, and futures on certainty. When you live a dangerous check-to-check lifestyle because you're certain the next check will come in, you're at risk when it doesn't. When you're certain that adjustable rate mortgage is ironclad, you'll be in for a rude awakening if it's not. If you put off your present for a better future, you might die never having lived it. So now we have the uncertainty of our own physical well-being combined with the uncertainty of the markets and institutions we put stake in. We can deal with uncertainty in one of two ways. We can pretend it doesn't exist and get blindsided, or we can set our lives up in a way that benefits from uncertainty. So how do you set your life up in a way that benefits from uncertainty? We'll discuss this idea in depth in the next chapter, but the formula for dealing with uncertainty is experimentation plus skill acquisition. You use experiments to develop new skills. The new skills you acquire equip you to handle an uncertain future. I've developed the skill of writing to a degree. My writing is decent enough that I can put money in my pocket with it. The freelance writing and publishing markets are booming. If for some reason I was subject to a major setback and found myself homeless, I could go to the public library and find writing jobs to get myself back on my feet. We all have the ability to develop skills, increase our passion, and give ourselves avenues of freedom. When you realize how much opportunity is available, you'll start to see escape routes from the prison of circumstance. Why every human being has won the lottery the minute you were born. Things got risky. Jim Rohn, think of the chances of being born. I won't even attempt to put an actual number to it, but I'll say this, it's small. You are the ultimate product of uncertainty. We live in a world that houses billions of agents of uncertainty, whose uncertain futures have created the society we live in and the infrastructure we benefit from. As Nassim Taleb notes in Anti-Fragile, innovation was created out of uncertainty, not out of a textbook. The inventors and tinkerers, often people without formal credentials, are responsible for most advances in technology. If Edison, or anyone like him, wanted certainty in his inventions working, we'd be living in the dark. Invention is uncertainty, and true reinvention requires uncertainty. We live in an amazing world. The sheer scope of what's been accomplished and the opportunity available to us is downright ridiculous. You are lucky. Every time I focus on what I don't have, I lose my creativity and I'm filled with negativity. When I realize I'm lucky to even be here, and that I should be thankful to even be allowed to move forward with uncertainty, I do things like write books. How many copies will this book sell? I don't know, but it'll be my second book. At one point in time, writing one book would have been unimaginable. I could have been like many aspiring writers and let my fear of uncertainty stop me. I feel the fear just as much as they do. The only difference is the fact that I focus on the blessing of opportunity more than they do. Whenever the conversation changes from, "What will happen if I try?" to "Wow, I get to try," good things seem to happen. To throw even more icing on the cake, you're in a better position than all your ancestors. Let's dig all the way back. You aren't at risk of being mauled by a saber-toothed tiger daily. You don't have a 1 in 3 chance of dying from the bubonic plague. Awesome. You don't even have the traditional barriers to entrepreneurship and creative endeavors as your grandparents did. Ding ding ding. Back then, if you wanted to be a singer or a radio host, your chances were slim to none. Now there's YouTube and podcasts. If you wanted to write and publish a book, good luck getting a publisher to notice. Now, you can publish your own books and make good money from them. Are the odds of finding massive success in any of these areas high? I wouldn't say that, but they're much higher than they've ever been before. The chances of you living that crazy cool life you picture in your head are higher than your chance of even being here. So, come off it, would you? The world is an uncertain place, but it's beautiful in a poetic and dangerous way. Let's live. Are you starting to value your freedom now? I hope so. When you're free, you realize your life is nothing more than a video game with chances to restart and reinvent, until the plug is pulled. You don't know how long you have either, so I'd say it's in your best interest to get started. How to reinvent yourself. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was driving in the car with my wife, and I started talking about my future. I think I want to start a blog and do some sort of writing. I love to write, I said. Well, why don't you just write, she replied. It wasn't the first time I mentioned wanting to write, and she always met me with the same reply. Looking back, it seemed simple. I should have just started writing. It took years after those conversations before I began to write. I made the idea of writing seem more daunting than it was. In my mind, I pictured having a popular blog or a finished book, and those two accomplishments seemed so daunting. Instead, I should have started with a small experiment and followed a method to figure out if writing was for me. That's what scientists do. They don't declare they're going to write the origin of species or discover a new type of medicine. They start with an observation. My observation was, writing seems like it'd be fun. Once I finally did follow through with my experiment, I wrote more and more. To date, I've written at least 500,000 words and have finished 2 books. I never set out to do these things initially. I started small. Whether you know it or not, you have these observations, too. Finding a new career, hobby, passion, or skill isn't mysterious. The signs are there if you look for them. On your path to discovering what you should do with your future, don't get caught in the trap of thinking your path must go in a straight line. The passion myth. I have a confession to make. I once believed in the myth of the one true calling, or one true passion. The idea of having one big, whopping, life-changing passion can make you feel bad if you haven't found it yet and put you under pressure to find it. I now believe you can have many passions. You have seeds of interests waiting to sprout, but they won't grow without watering them with action. I used to believe if you looked within yourself long enough, you'd determine your passion. I was half right. Finding passion does involve uncovering what's already inside of you, but you don't find it solely by looking inside. You can't sit alone in a room and decide what your passion is. Passion comes from doing, testing, and seeing what happens. On top of that, the idea of passion has been overstated. You've been told that anything less than pure happiness, joy, and contentment doesn't equal passion. You've also been told you should feel super passionate about your calling right away. Find something you love and you'll never have to work another day in your life. The truth is you're more likely to feel passionate after you get good at something. Instead of bliss, think competence. In the book So Good They Can't Ignore You, Cal Newport argues that building up your career capital by accumulating and refining rare and valuable skills will lead to passion. Success in a vocation happens when the things you're interested in intersect with something the market wants. I was interested in writing, and I continued to work to get better at it. I'm learning how to become a speaker now. I'm developing skills in digital marketing and search engine optimization, SEO. I feel passionate when I become more certain that I have a handle on what I'm doing. I'm building career capital. Career capital gives you the obvious benefit of money, but it also gives you autonomy. When you're so good at what you do you can't be ignored, the work you provide becomes indispensable. You can start to set your own terms in the workplace or break free on your own and make a living with your skills. When it comes to reinventing yourself, many areas come to mind: career, health, and relationships. But I chose career/vocation because it's central to the positivity or negativity of most of our lives. The examples I'm about to show skew towards careers, vocations, or side projects, but the experiment framework can be used in any area of your life. Life's laboratory: how to reinvent yourself with constant experimentation. Life doesn't promise you success. It promises a laboratory. James Altucher. Have you ever watched a comedy special where every joke landed and made your stomach hurt with laughter? It's hard to stand on stage and make people laugh for an entire hour. How do the world's best comedians come up with these amazing routines? They do it through constant experimentation. In the book, Little Bets, the author Peter Sims talks about the process famous comedian Chris Rock uses to come up with his routines. He'll show up at a dive comedy club unannounced. He'll have a couple of jokes scribbled down on a notepad. Being Chris Rock, he's always led on stage, and he does a 15-minute to half-an-hour set where he does his jokes. Most of the jokes bomb, but a few will make the crowd laugh. He ditches the jokes that don't work and tries the routine again at another club. If a handful of jokes get laughs at every club, he knows they're worthy of his routine. Why am I telling you this? I want to illustrate the idea of making little bets in your life. Reinvention on a grand scale comes with dozens of smaller reinventions, and those reinventions come through experiments. Just like a scientist doesn't know his theory will work, and just like a comedian knows his jokes won't necessarily land, you won't know what will make your life more enjoyable and meaningful until you test it out. Now, we're going to run your first experiment to help you discover the next step in your reinvention. Guidelines for the experiment: we're going to follow the rules of science and go through all the steps in the scientific method to help you find out what you might be interested in doing. Step 1. Ask a question. The scientific method starts when you ask a question about something that you observe: how, what, when, who, which, why, or where. Before we get to the question for your experiment, let's dig into your interests to point you in the right direction. Use your downloadable end-of-chapter worksheet or take out a pen and paper. Look at the following questions and come up with answers to help you come up with the main question for your experiment. What do you find easy that others find difficult? What seems obvious to you that isn't apparent to others? What do you find yourself talking about with friends to the point they won't get you to shut up? If you could only choose one section in the bookstore to read, what would it be? What do you remember being drawn to or interested in as a child? What kind of articles do you read and share online? What have you witnessed someone else doing that made you think, wow, that would be cool? Once you have your list in front of you, look at it and think on it for a little while. Is there an answer that pulls you? I bet there is. When you find an answer to one of those questions that stand out, you can use it to ask your observation question. In my case, the question ended up being, how do I become a writer? Step 2. Do background research rather than starting from scratch in putting together a plan for answering your question. You want to be a savvy scientist using library and internet research to help you find the best way to do things and ensure that you don't repeat mistakes from the past. Now that you have a slight inkling into what you think you'd enjoy doing, you can take some time to explore and learn more about the subject. If your interests lie in writing, you could start with a simple Google search, how to become a writer. That's what I did. I remember stumbling across articles about self-publishing books and making a full-time living from them. The idea excited me. They said you had to build a writing habit, build up a following, write the book, and work with editors and designers to create the book. Everything sounded doable. Unfortunately, I lingered in the research phase much too long and didn't move into the actual experiment for a while. But I did realize it was something I was interested in. After you've done some research into your chosen subject, writing, online business, yoga instructing, whatever it may be, you'll have an idea as to whether it seems doable. Not easy, but doable. If you decide it's doable, you move into the hypothesis stage. Step 3. Form a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an educated guess about how things work. It is an attempt to answer your question with an explanation that can be tested. A good hypothesis allows you to then make a prediction. If underscore 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 underscore, I do this, underscore 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 underscore, then underscore 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 underscore, this underscore 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 will happen. The hypothesis that led me to where I am today was, if I start writing, I'll enjoy it. That's it. Not, if I start writing, I'm going to become a best-selling author. Most scientific experiments have a more complicated hypothesis. But for people like you and me, who just want to become better versions of ourselves and have more interesting experiences, the experiment only has to test whether or not we'd find something enjoyable after trying it for a certain period of time. Step 4. Run the experiment. Your experiment tests whether your prediction is accurate and thus your hypothesis is supported or not. If you don't give yourself a decent amount of time for your trial run, it won't be a good experiment. Take writing for example. You've researched everything you need to know about starting your first blog. You're excited. You sit down to write your first post and hit publish. Nobody reads it. You call it a failed experiment and quit. This is what most people do when they try anything new. The early period of incompetence is often too much to bear, so they quit before they even have a chance to get good at what they're trying. If you can, try to set a time frame for your experiment that allows you to test yourself for an amount of time that really shows whether you enjoy it. The first few posts I wrote weren't great. Hell, the first book I wrote wasn't great. This one might not be either, but I have written enough to validate my hypothesis, and it's all I need to keep writing. So, how long do you set your time frame? In terms of how long it takes to get good enough to feel some sense of competence, some researchers say it takes at least 20 hours of practice. That's just minimum amount of time to be decent. But how long should you run your test if you're looking to see if your new skill is viable enough to be something worth pursuing long term? 30 days seems like a nice round number, but I prefer 66. Why? Because it's the research-based timeframe it takes to create a habit that sticks. Per a study done by University College London, it takes an average of 66 days to make a habit stick. Daily practices, even if they're short, form habits. If you're working on a business idea, you can spend a half hour per day researching and making contacts. If you're trying to write, you can write for a designated amount of time each day. Whatever you're attempting, give it time to sink in. It also gives you enough time to work through the phase where you're struggling to grasp what you're doing. Before you begin the experiment, Keep this in mind, you will struggle in the beginning. There's a difference between something being difficult and having no interest in it. You might find it difficult to play the guitar at first, but it doesn't mean you won't enjoy playing it once you know how. When you start a new side career like writing or a form of online business, I guarantee you won't have much traction in the beginning. The goal of your experiment is to see if it's a path worth pursuing long term. We're not actual scientists, so we don't have to use the same amount of rigor they do. You'll run your experiment, but while you're doing so, keep these things in mind. We're not going to take statistics and analyze them. That's called quantitative data. Your experiment will be qualitative, meaning the results will be based on your experiences. Here are some qualitative measures to look out for when you're trying your new venture/hobby/path. How do the little victories feel? When I wrote my first blog post, it felt great. When I published my first post on a popular website, it felt great. I didn't accomplish a ton in the beginning, but I had enough wins to let me know I was on the right track. That's what you're looking for. Do you find flow? Flow happens when you become so immersed in what you're doing you lose your sense of self. It's also known as being in the zone. I don't know of a specific measure for happiness that's universal, but many people who believe they've found their passion or calling describe feeling flow often in their work. Do you start to imagine a long-term route? When I started writing, I simply wanted to get words on the page because I'd never done it. After I settled in, I thought to myself, I might want to do this full-time. You can create other measures for yourself, too. These are just a guideline to start. The important thing to remember is that you're just giving your new path a test drive, and if you commit to a decent length of time to test it out, you'll have a good idea of whether it's right for you. Maybe you'll try it out for 2.5 months and find it isn't right for you, but in the long run you'll appreciate the fact that you tried. People often regret the things they didn't do, not the things they did. When your experiment fails, at least you know, but if you never try, you always have to wonder if you let an opportunity slip by, and that can hurt even worse than failure. Step 5. Come to a conclusion. You started with your hypothesis. Now it's time to see if you were right. With a real experiment, there are all sorts of measures that must be hit in order to make a firm conclusion. You must present your findings to your peers and they have to approve them. In your case, you'll just want to see if your experiment was near the mark you set. Try not to measure your results in terms of factors you can't control. Try measuring them in terms of the amount of effort you could put forth, whether or not you enjoyed yourself, and if you can see yourself doing what you're doing long term. Don't let yourself off the hook either. Don't say the experiment was a failure because it was difficult and you didn't make enough progress. You can conclude it was a failure if you truly didn't feel anything while you tried. If you decided your experiment worked, you found satisfaction in your new venture, keep going. Start another experiment where you add a bit of difficulty. Say, if I write every day for 2 months, I'll have a finished manuscript. I gave you this framework to create a structured path toward experimentation and reinvention, but I use this process informally in many areas of my life. I always look at new opportunities as a test drive, and sometimes my experiments don't work out the way I hoped. Instead of getting discouraged, I continue to experiment, because I know the answers I'm looking for are out there. The subtle difference between experimentation and failure in business. To be a success, you only have to be right once. Mark Cuban. If you decide to think of change in terms of experiments, you'll realize nothing you do can ever be labeled a failure, except quitting for good. When a scientist starts an experiment, she just wants to find out if there's anything to the hunch she's having. There's no pressure to find success in the beginning because she doesn't even know exactly what she's looking for yet. Her job is to stay aware, notice things, and take an inch of information and make it a mile. With that mindset, it's more difficult to get discouraged. Any successful scientist has more failed experiments than successful ones. Many of the world's greatest discoveries happened while the scientist was looking for something else. When a scientist fails, they continue, knowing that they've ruled out at least one conclusion. They feel closer to the truth, not further away from it. If you embrace the scientist's mindset, I think you'll find the world will present new opportunities. Over time, you'll begin to enjoy testing different ideas. Some will succeed and some will fail, but you'll be en route to making discoveries about yourself you never could have imagined. There's no book in the world that will say if you do X then Y will happen. Actually, there are a lot of books like that, and they're all misleading. I wish there was a better answer. I wish I could believe in the foolproof techniques to find happiness, contentment, success, meaning, freedom, and joy. The truth is, we all lie on a spectrum. What will make some of us happy will make others unhappy. What some of us consider success, others consider minor achievements or even failure. I can't predict how your life will turn out. What I can say for certain is that nothing will happen if you don't experiment. Actually, something will happen. Your life will be guided without much of your input. Things will kind of just happen. When Thoreau said, "The masses of men lead lives of quiet desperation," I think he's talking about people who say no to opportunities, who never experiment, who just let life happen to them. What choice are you going to make? Feel the gravity of the fork in the road where you're standing. Look long into the future and imagine what will happen if you take either route. It's your life, and I can't tell you what to do with it, but I can remind you that it's yours, not society's, not your parents', and it doesn't belong to the voice in your head that tries to trick you into thinking you can't do it. Run experiments on every level. Try a 2-week experiment where you wake up earlier. Change parts of your diet for 30 days to see how it makes your body feel. Test and track the attempts you make. For me, success means you did the things you said you were going to do. It doesn't matter if they work out exactly the way you want them to. We've talked about reframing your self-image, accepting the past, and creating a new vision for your future, but you still have one menacing obstacle in your way. Change is a fight, and we're about to talk about your worst enemy. Hope you enjoyed this part. Don't forget to support our channel. Subscribe and hit the bell button. See you in next part.